The basement of the old administration building at Pearl Harbor held a secret that would reshape the course of the Pacific War. May 27, 1942. Lieutenant Commander Thomas Dyer sat hunched over his desk in that underground chamber, surrounded by 5-digit number sequences that blurred together after hours of intense concentration. His eyes felt raw and strained from the relentless shifts in this windowless space, Station Hypo, where the most critical intelligence work of the war took place. Benzodrine tablets kept his body functioning, pushing past the natural limits of fatigue, but nothing could ease the crushing weight of responsibility that pressed down with every decision he made. The pencil trembled between his fingers as he marked another entry on the worksheet in front of him. Around him, stacks of IBM punch cards towered like monuments to 6 months of grueling analysis, each one representing countless hours of painstaking work and accumulated knowledge that his team had fought to extract from the enemy's communications. Everything hinged on what these numbers revealed. Absolutely everything. The war itself, the Pacific Fleet. Thousands of American sailors whose lives depended on getting this right. He reached for another card, comparing the code groups against the patterns his team had assembled through 6 brutal months of around-the-clock effort. 3 floors above this basement, in the war room, Admiral Chester Nimitz waited for answers that would determine his next move. The Admiral faced an impossible choice. Should he risk his last 3 aircraft carriers against a Japanese Navy that possessed far superior numbers in every category of warship? The stakes had never been higher. After the shock of Pearl Harbor, after months of steady defeats spreading across the Pacific, this moment might represent America's single chance to stop Japanese expansion in its tracks. One miscalculation, one misread code group, one faulty assumption. Any of these could lose the Pacific War before summer ended. Dyer's fingers moved across the IBM card sorter, searching desperately for a pattern that might unlock the enemy's plans. Nearby, Commander Joseph Rochefort stood in his bathrobe and slippers, having not set foot outside this underground bunker for days on end. The bathrobe appeared eccentric to outsiders, but the reality was purely practical. The basement was stifling and inadequately ventilated, with heat from the IBM machines making standard uniforms absolutely unbearable. Rochefort's choice to abandon military protocol for comfort was nothing more than pragmatism in service of the mission. What mattered here was results, not dress codes, in this cramped, overheated space where the fate of nations hung in the balance of punch cards and code sheets. Neither man knew that within the next week, their work would fundamentally alter the trajectory of World War II. The message intercepts pointed to something massive on the horizon. The Imperial Japanese Navy was preparing the largest naval operation since Pearl Harbor itself. 4 fleet carriers, dozens of supporting warships, and hundreds of the Pacific's most experienced naval aviators were converging on a target marked by just 2 letters in the Japanese code, AF. But what was AF? Where exactly would the Japanese strike? The wrong answer meant losing the war in the Pacific before the summer heat faded. The mathematics painted a brutal picture. Japan commanded 10 fleet carriers, America possessed 3 in the Pacific, and one of those, the Yorktown, bore serious damage from the Battle of the Coral Sea just weeks before. If Nimitz positioned his carriers incorrectly, if Station Hypo's analysis proved wrong, the Japanese would accomplish what they had failed to do at Pearl Harbor: the complete destruction of American naval power in the Pacific. 6 months earlier, on a morning that would scar both nations forever, this transformation had begun. December 7, 1941, broke peaceful across the Hawaiian Islands. Families prepared for church, sailors aboard the battleships resting at Pearl Harbor, ate breakfast or snatched a few more hours of sleep on what should have been a quiet Sunday. The Pacific Fleet sat anchored in the harbor, formidable but careless, utterly unprepared for the catastrophe that was minutes away. At 7:55 that morning, peace ended. 353 Japanese aircraft appeared in 2 massive waves, descending on Pearl Harbor with devastating force. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had orchestrated the attack with meticulous precision. This brilliant strategist understood Japan's temporary advantage and America's tremendous industrial power. His objective was straightforward: eliminate the Pacific Fleet before America could mobilize its vast resources. Give Japan 6 months to a year to secure its conquests across the Pacific and Southeast Asia, then negotiate peace from a position of strength. 2 hours later, the results were catastrophic beyond measure. 8 battleships were either sunk or severely damaged. The USS Arizona took a 1,800-pound armor-piercing bomb that penetrated the forward magazine. The explosion was so violent, it lifted the entire 30,000-ton warship out of the water. Over 1,100 men died in seconds, entombed forever inside their ship. Sailors on nearby vessels watched Arizona rise up, break apart, and sink to the harbor floor in less than 9 minutes. They would never forget that sight. The USS Oklahoma, ripped open by torpedo hits along her port side, rolled over completely. 429 sailors and Marines found themselves trapped inside her capsized hull. Some survived in air pockets for days, their desperate hammering echoing against the metal in a rhythm that rescue workers could hear but could not answer. The USS West Virginia sank to the harbor bottom, claiming 106 crew members. Unlike Oklahoma and Arizona, West Virginia would eventually be raised, repaired, and see action in the Pacific War. But on December 7th, she was simply another symbol of American vulnerability. Over 180 aircraft were destroyed on the ground. Hangars and maintenance facilities lay in ruins. The final count: 2,403 Americans killed. Navy lost 2,008. The Marine Corps lost 109. The Army lost 218. Civilians lost 68. Another 1,000 wounded, many of them bearing injuries that would never fully heal. The Pacific Fleet, America's shield against Japanese expansion, lay shattered across the harbor floor. Admiral Husband Kimmel, commanding the Pacific Fleet, watched his command burn from his headquarters windows. As he stood there, trying to comprehend the scope of the disaster, a spent bullet shattered the glass beside him. He bent down and picked up the deformed projectile, turned it over in his hands, then said quietly to an aide that it would have been merciful if that bullet had taken his life. Kimmel understood instantly that his career was finished, that history would assign him responsibility for America's worst military disaster. Within days, he would be removed from command, replaced by Admiral Chester Nimitz. His request for a court-martial to clear his name would be denied, and the weight of Pearl Harbor would follow him until his death. Yet the attack, devastating as it was, had missed the most critical targets. All 3 Pacific Fleet carriers were absent that morning. The Enterprise was returning from Wake Island, delayed by weather that turned out to be fortunate. The Lexington was ferrying planes to Midway. The Saratoga sat in dry dock on the west coast, undergoing maintenance. Aircraft carriers, not battleships, would determine the outcome of this war, though few people understood that fundamental change in naval warfare. The battleship era was ending, the age of carrier combat was beginning, and America, through luck and Japanese miscalculation, still possessed its carriers in the Pacific. The Japanese planners had also overlooked Pearl Harbor's fuel storage facilities, massive installations holding millions of gallons of oil essential to keeping the fleet operational. They ignored the repair facilities, the dry docks, the submarine base, and all the naval infrastructure. Japanese strategists assumed these would be irrelevant after the fleet was destroyed. They were devastatingly wrong. These intact facilities would allow Pearl Harbor to become the base for America's counteroffensive across the Pacific. The submarines based there would sink enormous quantities of Japanese merchant shipping. The repair yards would restore damaged ships, including vessels the Japanese believed they had destroyed. Within months, Pearl Harbor would transform from a symbol of defeat into a center of frantic activity supporting America's war effort. In that basement dungeon at Pearl Harbor, Commander Joseph Rochefort inherited a task that seemed impossible. Station Hypo, the Navy's signals intelligence unit in Hawaii, had been monitoring Japanese communications for years, but with limited results. The unit's official name was Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, though everyone called it Station Hypo, using the phonetic letter H for Haiea, Hawaii, where radio intercept towers stood. Before Pearl Harbor, they could read perhaps 10 to 15% of Japanese naval messages, and most of those only partially. It provided some intelligence value, but nowhere near enough to predict major operations like the Pearl Harbor assault. The primary Japanese operational code, which American crypt analysts called JN-25, consisted of roughly 30,000 to 33,000 five-digit number groups in actual use, with each group representing a word or phrase. The system was ingeniously complex. Each five-digit group from the codebook represented a specific word, phrase, or concept. But the Japanese made decryption harder still by super-enciphering these code groups using additive tables. They essentially encrypted the messages twice over. First, the message was encoded using the codebook. Then random five-digit numbers from separate additive books were added to each code group using non-carrying addition. The result was a message that appeared to be purely random numbers, resistant to frequency analysis and pattern recognition techniques. Breaking this system required stripping away the additive layer through mathematical analysis, then determining the meaning of each five-digit code group through exhausting analysis of usage patterns across thousands of intercepted messages. The cryptanalysts had to identify which additive table was used for each message, subtract those additives to expose the original code groups, then work out what each code group meant. And the Japanese regularly changed both the codebooks and additive tables, forcing the analysts to start completely over repeatedly. The additive books contained 300 pages, with each page listing 100 random five-digit numbers. To encrypt a message, the sender would begin at a specified page and line, adding each successive additive to the corresponding code group. The receiver, knowing the starting point, could subtract the same additives to retrieve the original code groups. For American cryptanalysts, figuring out which additive book and which starting point had been used was the first hurdle. Sometimes radio call signs or message indicators provided clues. Other times, they had to test hundreds of different possibilities. On December 1, 1941, just 6 days before Pearl Harbor, the Japanese switched to a new version of JN-25, which American analysts designated JN-25B. The new version used a different codebook and new additive tables, forcing the cryptanalysts back to square one. Every code group they had painstakingly identified became worthless overnight. Every additive recovery technique they had developed might no longer function. They were back at the beginning, staring at streams of five-digit numbers that meant nothing. Rochefort had sensed that an attack was coming somewhere, though he couldn't pinpoint the target. Traffic analysis, which studied communication patterns without reading actual messages, showed increased Japanese naval activity. Radio call signs changed with greater frequency. Message volumes spiked dramatically. Ships were moving. Something massive was happening. But the Japanese strike force that attacked Pearl Harbor had maintained absolute radio silence during their voyage from Japan. The 6 carriers and their escort ships transmitted nothing. You cannot track vessels that emit no signals. The Pearl Harbor Task Force departed Hitakapu Bay in the Kuril Islands on November 26, taking a northern route across the Pacific, where merchant ships and patrol aircraft would rarely venture. For 11 days they observed perfect communications discipline. Not a single radio transmission risked revealing their location or intentions. It represented the most profound intelligence failure in American history. Cryptanalysts, traffic analysts, and intelligence officers possessed pieces of the puzzle, but not enough to see the complete picture. Some warnings had reached Washington. Japanese diplomatic messages, encrypted in a different system called Purple, had been partially decoded and revealed mounting tension. But these diplomatic messages contained no military operational details. The attack arrived as a total and devastating shock. Rochefort understood that dwelling on failure guaranteed more disasters. The only path forward led through the enemy's communications. If Station Hypo could break JN-25B, if they could read enough Japanese messages to understand their plans, perhaps Pearl Harbor need not be repeated. Perhaps intelligence could give Admiral Nimitz the one tool that might balance Japan's current superiority: knowledge of enemy intentions. Joseph John Rochefort had been an unlikely figure for such critical work. Born in Dayton, Ohio on May 12, 1900, he enlisted in the Navy in 1918 at age 17. When enlisting, he falsified his birth year to 1898 to appear older and more eligible for advancement, a deception that would persist in his service records throughout his entire career. He received his commission as an ensign after graduating from the Navy's Steam Engineering School at Stevens Institute of Technology on June 14, 1919. His early career revealed nothing remarkable, just another young officer ascending through the ranks. But a fellow officer spotted something others missed. Rochefort possessed exceptional ability at solving crossword puzzles. He excelled at auction bridge, an advanced card game demanding pattern recognition, memory, and logical thinking. These were not trivial abilities. They revealed a mind capable of discovering patterns within complexity, of making logical deductions from incomplete information. That officer recommended Rochefort for the Navy's cryptanalysis program, a small specialized field desperately hunting for talented people. In the early 1920s, naval cryptanalysis consisted of perhaps a dozen individuals working in cramped offices with minimal funding and minimal recognition, attempting to read the communications of potential enemies. Rochefort proved a natural, possessing gifts beyond mathematical ability alone. In the mid-1920s, the Navy sent him to Japan for 3 years of language and cultural study, from 1929 to 1932. During those years, he lived in Tokyo, studied Japanese at the Navy's language school, and absorbed himself in Japanese culture. He didn't simply acquire the language, he learned how Japanese people thought, how they communicated, how their military culture shaped their decision-making. He grasped Japanese concepts of honor, duty, and hierarchical communication that influenced military strategy. This cultural understanding, combined with his cryptanalytic training, made him uniquely positioned to command Station Hypo when war arrived. His deputy and chief crypt analyst was Lieutenant Commander Thomas Dyer, a Naval Academy graduate who had trained under Agnes Driscoll, the renowned cryptanalyst who pioneered adapting IBM punch card machines for code breaking. Driscoll, called Miss Aggie throughout the cryptanalytic world, had been breaking codes since World War I. She had trained many of the Navy's finest cryptanalysts and achieved crucial breakthroughs against Japanese naval codes during the 1920s and 1930s. Her realization that IBM tabulating machines could be repurposed for cryptanalysis had transformed the entire field. Dyer had served at Pearl Harbor since 1936, longer than anyone else in the unit. He possessed a remarkable memory for code groups and an almost supernatural talent for recognizing patterns within seemingly random numbers. He could examine a partially decoded message and sense what missing code groups might represent, based on context and usage from other intercepts. During the intense months building toward Midway, Dyer often worked marathon shifts with benzodrine tablets, maintaining his alertness. The amphetamines were standard issue for personnel handling critical assignments, requiring extended wakefulness. There were people out there getting shot at, Dyer would later explain in interviews. If it happened that these drugs caused some health damage long-term, so what? His colleagues joked that his desk sign captured the truth perfectly. You don't have to be crazy to work here, but it helps. That sign, visible to anyone entering the cryptanalysis section, spoke to the strange reality of the workplace. The cryptanalysis section was indeed an unusual place by military standards. Down in the basement facility, as temperatures climbed toward unbearable levels, officers abandoned their formal dress entirely. They worked in bathrobes and slippers, discarding the rigid military uniform as the IBM machines churned through endless calculations, their mechanical heat radiating into spaces with almost no ventilation. Marathon work sessions made conventional military attire not just uncomfortable, but frankly impractical. When survival and results were at stake, formal military discipline gave way to raw necessity. Rank became less important than analytical skill. The officer who could see patterns in the code mattered more than the officer with the most stripes on his sleeve. Rochefort had deliberately built something different down here, something that violated every traditional military principle. Junior officers could challenge their superiors if the analysis demanded it. Breakthroughs belonged to the entire team, not to individual career builders. He repeated this philosophy constantly, almost like a mantra. We can accomplish anything provided no one cares who gets the credit. In the rigid military hierarchy of 1942, this approach was nothing short of revolutionary. Normally, success and advancement moved hand in hand. Here, success was everything. Individual recognition meant nothing. But Rochefort grasped something fundamental about the work facing them. Breaking the Japanese Navy's JN-25 code required more than brilliant individuals working alone. It demanded collaboration, the free exchange of ideas, and the courage to question any assumption, regardless of which senior officer had made it. A young radio operator might spot a pattern that somehow escaped a decorated senior analyst. A linguist might offer crucial cultural context that helped the crypt analysts understand a partially decoded phrase. Every single person's observation could prove valuable. This collaborative culture would become absolutely essential when pressure mounted in the spring of 1942, when everything depended on reading Japanese messages faster and more accurately than anyone had managed before. The linguistics section fell under Marine Captain Alva Laswell, who had spent 3 years living in Tokyo studying Japanese, participating in the same exchange program that had trained Rochford years earlier. When the crucial midway period arrived, Laswell received a promotion to major on April 29, 1942, though historical records often still called him by his former rank. He led 5 other linguists, representing the Navy's finest Japanese language specialists. Their responsibility was translating those portions of messages the crypt analysts had successfully decrypted, then working alongside intelligence officers to determine what those messages actually revealed about Japanese naval operations. A partially decoded message mentioning carriers, aircraft, and fuel supplies could signal anything from a routine training exercise to a massive combat operation about to unfold. The linguists supplied the cultural and linguistic understanding that separated routine communications from critical intelligence requiring immediate action. The traffic analysis section, under Lieutenant Commander Thomas Huckins and John Williams, took a different approach entirely. They ignored message content and focused entirely on externals. Which stations communicated with which other stations? How much traffic flowed between units? What priority designations did messages carry? By mapping communication patterns, they could reveal operational plans even when the messages themselves remained locked behind encryption. Traffic analysis could provide warning of major operations days, sometimes weeks, before crypt analysts could read enough messages to grasp the details. A sudden surge of messages between carrier divisions and supply units might signal an impending sortie. Changes in radio call signs frequently preceded major operations. Sudden radio silence from a carrier division almost certainly meant they were underway for combat. This small group of specialists, confined to a windowless basement, equipped with inadequate machinery and burdened with overwhelming workload, would soon confront the most critical intelligence challenge in American history. The work moved painfully, agonizingly slow. Every intercepted message arrived as a string of 5-digit number groups, captured by radio intercept stations scattered across the Pacific. Radio operators stationed in Hawaii, Australia, and other far-flung locations maintained around-the-clock vigil on Japanese naval frequencies, transcribing every single message they heard. These messages traveled to Station Hypo for analysis. The crypt analysts faced their first obstacle immediately. They had to strip away the additive encryption using mathematical analysis. The Japanese system employed additive tables where operators added another 5-digit number to each code group using non-carrying addition. Take a code group of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Add an additive of 6, 7, 8, 9, 0. Each digit added separately without carrying to the next position produced 7, 9, 1, 3, 5. Decryption meant identifying which additive table had protected each message, then subtracting that additive to recover the original code group. Just this initial process consumed hours for a single message. The crypt analysts maintained enormous files of recovered additives, meticulously organized by date and radio circuit, searching constantly for patterns in how Japan's code operators employed their additive tables. Once they possessed the original code groups, the genuine work began. The crypt analysts had assembled massive card catalogs, representing years of accumulated knowledge about what each 5-digit number might mean. They made educated guesses depending on context, compared how specific code groups appeared across different messages, built gradually toward certainty. A code group appearing frequently in carrier communications might represent aircraft, aviation gasoline, or flight operations. One appearing in logistics messages might mean fuel, supplies, or ammunition. The IBM machines helped tremendously, allowing analysts to search through thousands of messages, hunting for patterns, comparing usage contexts, identifying code groups appearing together regularly, constructing networks of meaning. But actual analysis required human intelligence, intuition, and occasionally brilliant guesses. The machines could sort and search endlessly, but only human minds could interpret results, make intuitive leaps, recognize meaningful patterns within the chaos of partially decoded messages. This was detective work at the highest level, demanding mathematical precision, linguistic knowledge, cultural understanding, and creative thinking. By March 1942, Station Hypo had progressed sufficiently against JN-25 that they could supply genuinely useful intelligence about Japanese operations. The breakthrough hadn't emerged from a single dramatic moment, but rather from months of relentless grinding work. Each recovered code group rendered subsequent messages slightly more readable. Each identified additive pattern made stripping encryption slightly faster. Gradually, painfully, the Japanese communications began yielding their secrets. They provided intelligence for the Battle of the Coral Sea in early May, helping American Navy locate Japanese carriers and achieve a tactical stalemate, halting Japan's advance toward Australia. The Coral Sea battle held significance for multiple reasons. It was the first naval battle in history where opposing ships never came within sight of each other, with aircraft conducting all combat. It demonstrated that American carriers and pilots could fight effectively against experienced Japanese carrier forces. The battle damaged two Japanese carriers, the Shokaku and Zuikaku, keeping them out of service for the next major operation. Yet the work remained frustratingly incomplete. Even at their best moments, they could read perhaps 30 to 40% of any given message. Many messages remained completely incomprehensible. The Japanese kept changing codebooks and additives, demanding constant adaptation, and pressure never relented. Every message might hold intelligence, saving American lives, or preventing another catastrophe. Every hour spent on a message yielding nothing represented an hour that could have gone toward something productive. The crypt analysts carried the knowledge that their success or failure would ultimately be measured in American casualties. Then, in mid-May, they began intercepting messages describing a massive operation. Message traffic increased dramatically. Messages flew between combined fleet headquarters, carrier divisions, submarine squadrons, battleship divisions, and invasion forces. Everything pointed toward a major offensive scheduled for early June. Japanese operational security remained good, but they still needed to communicate to coordinate a complex operation involving dozens of ships operating across thousands of miles of ocean. Each partially readable message provided another puzzle piece. The target appeared in Japanese location codes as AF. Station Hypo was convinced AF meant Midway Island, a tiny atoll located 300 miles northwest of Hawaii. The atoll housed a small but strategically vital American airbase. Midway consisted of two small islands, Sand Island and Eastern Island, surrounded by coral reef. The entire atoll measured just over 2 miles across, yet its location gave it enormous strategic importance. If Japan seized Midway, they would threaten Hawaii itself and possess a base from which to dominate American communications across the Central Pacific. Even more critically, a Japanese operation against Midway would force America's remaining carriers into a decisive battle. Admiral Yamamoto wanted nothing more than destroying those carriers. He understood that Japan's industrial capacity could never match America's once American shipyards began mass-producing carriers. Japan needed to win during 1942, while they still maintained numerical and operational superiority. But in Washington, the Navy's main cryptanalysis center, designated OP-20G, disagreed with Station Hypo's assessment. Located in the Navy Department building in Washington, OP-20G was supposedly the superior organization. They possessed more personnel, better equipment, and the advantage of sitting at Naval Powers Center. Yet they lacked Station Hypo's specialized focus on the Pacific Theater and Rochford's team's accumulated experience with Japanese naval communications. The Washington analysts believed AF might be the Aleutian Islands in Alaska. Others suspected a renewed offensive in the South Pacific, aimed at Port Moresby, Fiji, or Samoa. Some feared an attack on Hawaii itself, or possibly even the American West Coast. Without certainty regarding the target, Admiral Nimitz couldn't position his forces effectively, concentrate his carriers near Midway while the Japanese attack elsewhere, and he would lose both his ships and the actual Japanese target. The disagreement intensified through late May. OP-20G had recently been reorganized. Lawrence Safford, a brilliant cryptanalyst known as the father of Navy cryptology, had been replaced by Commander John Redman, a communications officer with minimal cryptanalytic experience. Redman was competent in his previous communications role, but as assessments noted, remained untrained in cryptanalysis. He brought a communications officer's perspective to an analytical organization, emphasizing proper procedures and chain of command over analytical insights. This bureaucratic battle between Station Hypo and OP-20G transcended simple location disputes. It represented a fundamental struggle over control of naval intelligence. Rochefort maintained direct communication with Admiral Nimitz's intelligence officer, Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton, his friend from years studying Japanese, together in Tokyo between 1929 and 1932. This direct arrangement worked brilliantly within the Pacific Theater. Intelligence reached the commander who needed it without bureaucratic delays. From Washington's perspective, however, it violated proper procedure and undermined central control. Rochefort was bypassing established chain of command, providing intelligence directly to the fleet commander instead of routing it through official channels and OP-20G for validation. Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations commanding the entire U.S. Navy, trusted his Washington staff far more than this informal Hawaii arrangement. King was brilliant but difficult, known for his abrasive personality and his insistence on proper procedure. He disliked Rochefort intensely, viewing him as insubordinate and overconfident. Commander John Redman, leading OP-20G, resented Rochefort's independence and insisted all intelligence analysis should centralize in Washington for proper control and coordination. The disagreement involved more than bureaucratic territory. Lives hung in the balance. Position 3 carriers near Midway while the Japanese attack elsewhere, and America loses both her ships and the actual Japanese target. With only 3 carriers against Japan's carrier fleet, America couldn't afford being wrong even once. The Pacific Fleet couldn't withstand another Pearl Harbor disaster. If those 3 carriers went down, nothing would stand between Japan and Hawaii except some submarines and land-based aircraft. The West Coast would lay vulnerable. America's entire Pacific position would collapse. Everything depended on determining what AF meant. Captain Wilfred J. Jasper Holmes, serving on Station Hypo's staff, conceived the elegant solution that would settle this question. Holmes brought a submarine officer's practical mindset, combined with an analytical intelligence. He suggested that Midway transmit an uncoded message reporting that their water desalination plant had failed, and the base was running low on fresh water. If Japanese intelligence intercepted this message and then reported that AF was experiencing water shortages, Station Hypo would possess definitive proof that AF represented Midway. It was brilliantly simple, almost too simple to work. Yet simplicity constituted its strength. The Japanese were intercepting American communications precisely as Americans were reading Japanese messages. If they overheard an unencrypted emergency message about water shortages at Midway, they would have no reason suspecting it was false. Water desalination equipment broke regularly in tropical climates. Shortages represented natural consequences of equipment failure. Japanese intelligence services would report this valuable tactical information about a potential target. Rochefort immediately grasped Holmes's idea's brilliance and brought it to Edwin Layton, who presented it to Admiral Nimitz. Nimitz was precisely the commander willing to trust intelligence officers and accept calculated risks. He approved immediately. The garrison commander at Midway received instructions via secure submarine cable, a communications method Japan couldn't intercept, to transmit an emergency water supplies request in plain language that anyone monitoring radio frequencies could detect. Around May 19 to 21, 1942, Midway sent the message. The transmission went out in clear, unencrypted language, reporting equipment problems and requesting emergency water supplies from Pearl Harbor. Within 2 days, Station Hypo intercepted a Japanese intelligence report. The message, transmitted in JN-25 and partially decrypted by Rochefort's team, stated that AF was experiencing water shortages. The proof was irrefutable. AF meant Midway. The Japanese were coming, though Washington remained skeptical. OP-20G predicted mid-June, while Station Hypo predicted late May or early June, based on date indicators appearing in the messages. The date-time groups in Japanese messages were super-enciphered beyond standard JN-25 encryption, making them extraordinarily difficult to decrypt. OP-20G hadn't broken this date-time encryption. Station Hypo had, thanks to a breakthrough by Lieutenant Joseph Finnegan. Working under Dyer's supervision, Finnegan discovered the method Japan used to encrypt their date-time groups. It was a separate system layered atop JN-25, requiring additional mathematical analysis. Edwin Layton, in his memoir I Was There, specifically credited Finnegan with discovering the method Japan used to lock up their date-time groups. This breakthrough allowed Station Hypo to determine not just where Japanese forces would strike, but when. On May 26th, they intercepted orders for 2 destroyer groups escorting invasion transports and successfully decrypted the date-time data using Finnegan's methods. The orders specified that the attack would occur on either June 4th or 5th, 1942. This level of precision was unprecedented. Admiral Nimitz would know not just where to position his forces, but when the enemy would arrive. The Washington analysts questioned whether Rochford was being too aggressive in his interpretations, reading certainty into partial messages, allowing confidence to overcome analytical caution. Admiral King remained unconvinced. The career consequences for Rochford, if he was wrong, would be catastrophic. He would be blamed for misleading the Pacific Fleet commander, for risking America's last carriers on faulty analysis. His career would end, and worse, American sailors would die because of his mistake. Yet Rochford stood by his analysis. His team had been working 18 to 24-hour shifts for weeks, surviving on coffee, cigarettes, and occasional sandwiches brought to the basement. The evidence was overwhelming. Message traffic volume, the units involved, logistical preparations, date indicators, and the water ruse confirmation all pointed toward the same conclusion. Midway, early June, 4 carriers. This was Japan's next major operation. By May 27th, Rochford's team had decrypted sufficient messages to provide Nimitz with almost the entire Japanese order of battle. They knew the Japanese force would include 4 fleet carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. These were the same carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor, the most experienced carrier division anywhere in the world. They knew the force would include 2 battleships, among them Admiral Yamamoto's flagship, the Yamato, the largest and most powerful battleship ever constructed. They knew about 2 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, and 12 destroyers providing escort. They knew about approximately 250 carrier aircraft, flown by pilots with hundreds of hours of combat experience. They knew about the invasion force carrying 5,000 troops scheduled to land on Midway on June 7th. The intelligence was so detailed that Nimitz's staff could predict the Japanese approach route, the timing of the first airstrikes, and even the composition of attack formations. On May 27, 1942, at the Pacific Fleet Staff Conference, Rochford and Layton presented this intelligence to Admiral Nimitz. The case was compelling. The room filled with officers, many of them unconvinced that intelligence gathered this way could possibly be so detailed and accurate. Rochford stood before them, still dressed in his bathrobe, guiding each person through the evidence step by step. He showed them the partially decoded Japanese messages, walked them through the reasoning behind each conclusion, and explained how the analytical process had produced such remarkably specific information. No navy anywhere in the world had ever possessed intelligence this complete about an enemy's plans before a battle actually began. What had been accomplished was a cryptanalytic feat that would never be matched at this scale again. The breakthrough against JN-25 by the Station Hypo team, combined with the sheer volume of Japanese radio traffic flowing across the Pacific, plus the Japanese belief that their codes remained unbroken, had created an extraordinary intelligence opportunity. Nimitz possessed information that even many of Yamamoto's own officers didn't have access to. He grasped Yamamoto's strategy more clearly than some of the Japanese admiral's own subordinates understood it. Yet intelligence by itself cannot decide battles. Nimitz now confronted an impossible choice. He commanded 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. Enterprise and Hornet were in decent operational condition, but Yorktown carried severe damage. The earlier clash at Coral Sea had torn the carrier apart so badly that naval engineers initially believed she would require 3 months of reconstruction work at Puget Sound Navy Yard back on the American West Coast. Her flight deck bore serious structural wounds, her fuel systems had been crippled, and fires had devastated the ship, claiming the lives of numerous sailors. Yorktown should have been sitting idle until late summer. Nimitz made one of the war's most pivotal decisions. He ordered the repair teams at Pearl Harbor to make Yorktown seaworthy within 72 hours. Not perfectly restored, not fully repaired, but capable enough to launch and recover planes for one final engagement. The workers thought the task was impossible. They faced demands to complete in 3 days, work that normally consumed 90 days. What came next seemed almost miraculous in its execution. Yorktown descended into dry dock number 1 at 11 o'clock on the morning of May 28th. More than 1,400 workers descended on the vessel, laboring continuously without rest. Welders set to work repairing the structural injuries along the flight deck. Electricians reconnected the compromised electrical networks. Damage control crews sealed punctures and holes throughout the hull. Many repairs were only temporary solutions meant for later permanent fixing, but they would hold together for one more fight at sea. Workers remained aboard the carrier as she departed Pearl Harbor on the morning of May 30th, steaming to rendezvous with Enterprise and Hornet. Somewhere between 2 and 3 days of actual labor had been squeezed into those 3 calendar days. An incredible accomplishment that made Yorktown's participation in the upcoming clash possible. A raid against Japan's 4 fleet carriers, crewed by highly experienced naval aviators. Nimitz could muster only 3 carriers, whose pilots had far less battle experience. Japan had been waging war since 1937. Her naval aviators possessed hundreds of hours flying combat missions over China and throughout the Pacific region. These men had trained as units for years, perfecting complex aerial tactics. Her carriers operated as a unified strike force from the very beginning of the war, achieving seamless coordination between ships. American carrier tactics were still being developed and refined. Many American pilots had never experienced combat. Others had received only minimal instruction in the specialized demands of carrier flying. The experience gap was substantial. In almost every measurable way, the numbers favored Japan, but Nimitz possessed the supreme advantage that Rochefort had provided, intelligence so complete it was almost perfect. He stationed his carriers at a location called Point Luck, positioned 350 miles to the northeast of Midway, where they could intercept the Japanese carriers following their initial bombardment of Midway's airfields. The Japanese, believing they had achieved complete surprise, planned to assault the largely undefended atoll, retrieve their attacking aircraft, reload them with different ordnance, then pursue American carriers they assumed were either still anchored at Pearl Harbor or still many days distant from the region. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, leading the Japanese carrier force, was confident he possessed ample time to complete all his operations before facing any American resistance. He anticipated bombing Midway into submission, then spending the afternoon searching for American vessels if any happened to be in the vicinity. That 3 American carriers were already concealed to the northeast of Midway, lying in wait, never entered his calculations. Japanese naval intelligence had informed him that Yorktown had been destroyed at Coral Sea, that Enterprise and Hornet remained thousands of miles away, and that no American carriers possibly could arrive near Midway in the time frame he envisioned. Nimitz's bet was staggering in its audacity. Should Rochefort have miscalculated the location, miscalculated the timing, or misidentified the Japanese force composition, the Pacific Fleet would be annihilated, and Hawaii would lay exposed to invasion. If Washington's findings were accurate, yet the engagement unfolded badly, America would forfeit its final 3 carriers, and the Pacific conflict would be lost. Nimitz was risking his entire remaining naval force on mathematics and analysis accomplished by exhausted people working with primitive machinery in a basement. Everything balanced on the decryption of intercepted signals, on identifying individual code groups accurately, on interpreting fragmentary and partial translations, on assembling scattered pieces into a coherent whole. Rochefort and his team had furnished Nimitz with intelligence of extraordinary quality. Now American sailors and pilots would need to transform that intelligence into victory. On June 3, 1942, Navy reconnaissance aircraft discovered the approaching Japanese armada precisely where Rochefort's analysis had predicted it would be. The range-limited PBY Catalina flying boats made contact first with the transport vessels, then located the carriers. Each report from the reconnaissance planes confirmed Station Hypo's predictions regarding location, timing, composition of forces, confirming the intelligence down to precise details. Nimitz's calculated risk had proven sound. The stage was prepared. When dawn broke on June 4th, 108 Japanese aircraft launched from the 4 carriers bound for Midway. 36 Aichi D-3A dive bombers, 36 Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers equipped with high-explosive ordnance meant for ground targets, and 36 Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters for escort and defense. Midway's radar systems picked up the inbound formation at 93 miles distance at 5:45 in the morning. The island's defenders sent up every fighter available to meet the attackers. The Japanese strike force pounded Midway's infrastructure, demolishing fuel storage, aircraft hangars, and the operations center. American fighters attempted interception but became overwhelmed by the superior Zero fighters. Marine pilots flying outdated F-2A Buffalo aircraft endured appalling losses. Anti-aircraft fire from the ground damaged several attacking planes, but the assault accomplished its primary objectives. The Japanese flight leader radioed that an additional strike would be required. The runways suffered damage, yet remained usable. Some defending aircraft had managed to survive. The base functioned, though diminished, but then something unexpected occurred. American planes launched from Midway attacked the Japanese carriers. Marine dive bombers, Army Air Force B-17 bombers, and Navy torpedo bombers assaulted the Japanese fleet without achieving hits, suffering devastating casualties of their own. Yet they succeeded in keeping the Japanese fighter screen occupied and disrupted. They snarled the Japanese operational rhythm. They demonstrated that American forces possessed more capability and resolve than Japanese intelligence had estimated. Admiral Nagumo faced a consequential decision. His aircraft were returning depleted of fuel and desperate to land. Initial assessments indicated that neutralizing Midway completely would require another bombing strike. He followed established protocol and commanded his backup aircraft to be outfitted with high-explosive bombs designed for attacking ground targets. Loading crews began removing the armor-piercing bombs and torpedo weapons from the aircraft, positioned on the flight decks and in the hangars, swapping them for high-explosive ordnance designed to strike land targets. Then at 7:28 in the morning, circumstances shifted. A Japanese scout plane, delayed by a catapult malfunction, radioed that he had spotted 10 American surface vessels to the northeast. The initial message didn't identify what types of ships, but any American vessels in this area constituted a complete surprise. Nagumo suddenly grappled with the prospect of American carriers present, something he had been assured was completely impossible. Yorktown supposedly lay at the bottom of the Coral Sea. Enterprise and Hornet supposedly remained far from Midway's vicinity. Nagumo halted the rearming operation immediately and ordered the aircraft switched back to anti-ship weapons, torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs. The ordnance teams reversed their efforts, extracting the land attack ordnance they had just installed, hauling up anti-ship weapons from storage compartments below. The flight decks and hangars of all 4 Japanese carriers transformed into scenes of frenzied activity. Bombs just mounted on aircraft came off and descended below. Torpedoes climbed up from the magazines and got attached to waiting planes. Fuel hoses stayed connected to aircraft undergoing rearming. Loose ordnance, both bombs and torpedoes, accumulated across the deck because there was insufficient time to stow everything properly in magazines while simultaneously preparing planes for immediate launch. This created the worst conceivable conditions aboard an aircraft carrier. Planes saturated with fuel sat amidst scattered bombs and torpedoes, while aviation fuel vapors hung thick in the air. At 10:22 in the morning, American dive bombers appeared above. 3 squadrons of Douglas Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown had become split from their fighter escort and torpedo bombers during the journey to strike the target, but they had located the Japanese carriers at the optimal moment. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, commanding Enterprise's air group, had extended his search beyond the projected intercept point, staking his remaining fuel on locating the Japanese fleet. His gamble succeeded when he identified the wake of a Japanese destroyer racing to rejoin its carrier formation. The Japanese carriers were attempting to launch their assault against the American fleet. Their decks overflowed with armed and fueled aircraft. Their fighter protective force was down at sea level, having just finished eliminating the previous American torpedo bomber assaults. The torpedo bombers from all 3 American carriers had charged ahead with suicidal determination, knowing their slow machines had almost no chance against Zeros. 41 torpedo bombers attacked. 35 fell from the sky without a single torpedo reaching a Japanese ship. Yet this sacrifice accomplished its purpose. It drew the Japanese fighters downward and disrupted their defensive organization. The dauntless pilots nosed into their dives from 14,000 feet, accelerating to speeds near 250 knots. In roughly 6 minutes of perfectly synchronized strikes, they obliterated 3 Japanese carriers. The assault proved so precisely timed, so expertly executed, that to the Japanese it appeared as one unstoppable, overwhelming onslaught. The Akagi caught a bomb straight through the flight deck that exploded inside the hangar bay, surrounded by armed and fueled aircraft. Chain reactions erupted through the ship. Aviation fuel spilled across the hangar deck, ignited instantly, sending flames roaring through the compartment. Within moments, Akagi burned without any ability to control it. Admiral Nagumo and his staff were forced to leave the flagship. The Kaga sustained 4 bomb strikes in quick succession. The forward elevator tore from its shaft. The command tower was demolished. Fire engulfed the entire length of the ship, from bow to stern. Explosions of ammunition and fuel continued rocking the vessel for hours. The captain commanded abandoned ship but remained aboard himself, going down with his carrier. The Soryu absorbed 3 direct bomb hits, all arriving within seconds of each other, devastating the vessel catastrophically. The flight deck split open. The hangar transformed into a roaring inferno. Soryu's crew attempted to rescue their ship, but the injuries were beyond their capacity to manage. After 20 minutes of intense firefighting efforts, the captain commanded evacuation. He stayed with the vessel. Soryu sank 7 hours afterward, drowning 711 sailors. All 3 carriers faced destruction within minutes. Their crews fled as uncontrollable infernos consumed the ships. Japanese damage control training, which prioritized fighting fires over controlling flooding, proved inadequate against the scale of destruction and the severity of the fuel fires. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, had drifted away from the others earlier that morning and avoided the first assault. She dispatched her own aircraft that struck the Yorktown hard, striking the American carrier with bombs and torpedoes that stopped her dead in the water. Yet American dive bombers located the Hiryu later that afternoon and set her burning alongside her sister ships. When evening arrived on June 4th, all 4 Japanese fleet carriers were either sinking or abandoned. Japan lost 3,057 sailors, many of them among her finest naval aviators and technicians. Among the dead were some of aviation's greatest experts, individuals who had attacked Pearl Harbor, overrun the Philippines, sunk the Prince of Wales and Repulse, and held dominion over the Pacific for half a year. Replacing them would prove impossible. The United States lost the Yorktown, destroyed by submarine attack 2 days later while undergoing tow back to port. The Japanese submarine I-168 located the carrier on June 6th and discharged 2 torpedoes into her hull. A 4th torpedo sank the destroyer Hammond, standing alongside Yorktown. The carrier capsized and dropped beneath the waves on June 7th. American losses totaled 362 sailors. In roughly 6 minutes of perfectly executed dive bombing, the Pacific War underwent transformation. The shift proved absolute and irreversible. Japan had opened the conflict with overwhelming carrier superiority. Following Midway, She lost 4 of her 6 fleet carriers and possessed no means to rebuild them. Japanese manufacturing could not keep pace with American industrial capacity. The United States was preparing to launch dozens of fresh carriers from its vast manufacturing base. The Essex-class carriers sat under construction in American shipyards. Each one would exceed the carriers that perished at Midway in size and capability. Japan never again would launch offensive strikes. Every subsequent engagement became defensive struggle, attempting to defend territories already seized. American manufacturing power would erode Japanese strength relentlessly yet inevitably. The upheaval that Rochefort's intelligence had made possible would define the entire remaining Pacific conflict. And it had begun with 5-digit number sequences punched onto cards in a basement facility in Hawaii. The arrival of the dive bombers, at the exact instant the Japanese carriers lay most vulnerable, contained an element of chance, yet also reflected genuine understanding of how Japanese procedures operated, allowing prediction of when the carriers would be changing their aircraft armament. Such prediction would have remained impossible without the JN-25 breakthrough and the grueling analytical labor that permitted Rochefort's people to comprehend Japanese intentions. Recognition for this achievement would prove difficult and wrapped in bureaucratic disputes. The conflict between Station Hypo and OP-20G in Washington intensified following Midway rather than subsiding. Both organizations took credit for the triumph. Washington claimed their analysis had contributed to victory. Station Hypo maintained their work had proven decisive. The disagreement turned personal and acrimonious. Commander John Redmond, operating OP-20G, resented Rochefort's operational independence and his special direct connection to Nimitz. Redmond's brother, Admiral Joseph Redmond, occupied a powerful role in naval communications and pushed efforts to transfer cryptanalytic authority to Washington under his brother's control. Admiral Ernest King, serving as Chief of Naval Operations, backed the Redmond faction. King favored centralized authority and questioned Rochefort's unconventional methods. By October 1942, merely 4 months after Midway, Rochefort was removed from leadership at Station Hypo and transferred to command a floating repair facility anchored in San Francisco. The stated justification claimed he needed shore-duty rotation for career development. Everyone grasped what this represented: retaliation for going around proper channels. Rochefort had been absolutely correct in his assessment of Midway. His breakthrough analysis had delivered America's greatest naval triumph of the entire war, yet he had circumvented the chain of command and infuriated several high-ranking officials in Washington, earning the lasting enmity of the influential Redmond brothers. Admiral Nimitz felt the fury but lacked the authority to stop it. Admiral King controlled the entire Navy. Nimitz held command only of the Pacific Fleet. When disagreements arose between fleet commanders and the Chief of Naval Operations, that top position always prevailed. Still, Nimitz moved quickly, recommending Rochefort for the Distinguished Service Medal directly following Midway. His citation highlighted Rochefort's consistently outstanding contributions and emphasized how substantially his analysis had shaped the victory. King's office simply rejected the recommendation. Rochefort's code-breaking days were finished. He received command of a floating dry dock, essentially a career graveyard for someone of his talents and potential. Subsequently, he landed administrative work at Pacific Fleet headquarters. The command promotion he desperately sought never materialized. His rank stopped at captain. By the time he stepped down from service in 1953, the recognition he had genuinely earned for his role at Midway had never arrived. This profound wrong would require decades to address, but the intelligence work pressed forward. Throughout the remainder of 1942 and across 1943, Station Hypo persisted in deciphering Japanese naval traffic, though now under different leadership. This intelligence made possible the Guadalcanal offensive, an exceptionally fierce half-year confrontation between American and Japanese forces vying for mastery of a crucial strategic position. Intercepted and decoded transmissions allowed American naval forces to arrange themselves advantageously before engagements, provided advance warning of approaching Japanese reinforcement fleets, and gave crucial information about enemy movements and capabilities. The intelligence supported the island-hopping approach unfolding across the Central Pacific. whereby American forces deliberately avoided heavily fortified Japanese positions and instead captured less protected islands, thereby severing Japanese supply networks and steadily closing the distance toward Japan. Every campaign reaped enormous benefits from signals intelligence revealing where Japanese units stood, exposing their weak spots, and alerting command to imminent counteroffensives. Station Hypo's contribution ultimately made possible Operation Vengeance in April 1943, an audacious strike where American fighter pilots located and destroyed Admiral Yamamoto's aircraft based on intelligence derived from decrypted messages. Yamamoto traveled from Rabaul heading toward Bougainville to conduct inspections of forward combat zones. Station Hypo's teams intercepted and cracked the transmissions carrying his full schedule, exact departure hour, precise pathway, and expected landing moment. This information ascended the chain directly to President Roosevelt himself, who authorized the operation. 18 P-38 Lightning fighters launched from Guadalcanal met Yamamoto's transport plane precisely on schedule and shot it from the sky. Yamamoto, the brilliant strategist who had engineered Pearl Harbor and stood as Japan's finest naval commander, perished in the Bougainville jungle. His death delivered a catastrophic blow to Japanese morale and fighting spirit. Thomas Dyer remained with Station Hypo throughout the conflict, advancing to the rank of captain. His contributions to JN-25 breakthroughs and his pivotal supervision of the crucial discoveries that made Midway possible would ultimately earn him recognition within cryptology circles as the pioneer of mechanical cryptanalysis. Following the war's conclusion, he became one of 3 principal cryptanalysis instructors for both the Armed Forces Security Agency and subsequently the National Security Agency, collaborating with William Friedman and Lambros Kalimahos. His methodologies for employing IBM equipment in codebreaking left a lasting mark on generations of signals intelligence specialists. Edwin Layton, serving as Nimitz's intelligence chief and the officer who had championed Rochefort's findings and delivered them to the admiral, continued his role throughout the Pacific conflict and concluded his career as a rear admiral. Following the war, Layton devoted considerable years to campaigning for recognition of Rochefort's vital contributions. His book, And I Was There, released in 1985, furnished extensive proof of Rochefort's accomplishments and the serious injustice inflicted upon him. Layton remained steadfast in his commitment to his friend's legacy. Joseph Finnegan, the man who unraveled the approach to decrypting Japanese date-time components, prolonged his own cryptanalytic work and ascended to prominence in the post-war signals intelligence sphere. His particular discovery had proven absolutely essential to establishing the exact assault date, making it possible for Nimitz to arrange his forces with extraordinary precision. Without this date intelligence, the American carriers might have appeared too soon, consuming fuel reserves, or arrived too late, missing the engagement entirely. The analysts, cryptographers, linguists, and traffic specialists who had labored through those grueling hours in Pearl Harbor's basement facility dispersed into diverse professional paths. Most remained entirely silent about their contributions due to lengthy classification requirements that persisted throughout multiple decades. What they had accomplished remained hidden away in classified vaults for more than 3 decades following the conflict's finish. Their children never comprehended their father's war contributions. Acquaintances questioned why these men had remained in Hawaii instead of entering combat. These codebreakers maintained their secrets in silence, denied the opportunity to receive recognition for intelligence work that had transformed world history. American penetration of Japanese codes stayed concealed from public view until the mid-1970s arrived, when the National Security Agency commenced releasing records regarding World War II code-breaking work. Only then could scholars and the wider public grasp the complete magnitude of American cryptanalytic success, the breadth of intelligence's impact on major operations, and how indispensable Rochefort, Dyer, and their colleagues had proven to the ultimate Allied triumph. Beginning in 1980, a concentrated push emerged to obtain rightful acknowledgement for Rochefort's contributions. Rear Admiral Donald Mack Showers, himself a wartime naval intelligence specialist who afterward served at the CIA, orchestrated this initiative. Navy Secretary John Lehman joined him, recognizing both the historical magnitude and the unfairness of how Rochefort had been dealt with. The campaign gathered strength as classified materials became available to scholars, and Station Hypo's true achievements could ultimately be publicly revealed. On May 30th, 1986, precisely 44 years following the Midway engagement, President Ronald Reagan presented the Distinguished Service Medal to Joseph Rochefort posthumously. Rochefort had passed away on July 20th, 1976, never having learned that formal recognition would eventually come, though decades too late. His family members received the medal at a White House presentation ceremony. The official statement emphasized his consistently excellent performance and acknowledged that his intelligence contributions proved decisive to American success at Midway. These restrained words actually described the most consequential intelligence accomplishment in all of American warfare. The saga of how a single man's expertise in code-breaking redirected the trajectory of World War II illuminates fundamental lessons concerning intelligence work, command judgment, and human ingenuity. Rochefort triumphed through combining an exceptional array of capabilities: mathematical knowledge essential for cryptanalysis, thorough comprehension of Japanese language and culture developed through 3 years residing in Tokyo between 1929 and 1932, sophisticated intelligence analysis abilities, and management aptitudes fostering teamwork and creative breakthroughs. His readiness to subvert formal structures for delivering vital intelligence to commanders who needed it demonstrated genuine bravery of principle. His insistence on precision, despite mounting pressure from Washington, illustrated intellectual honesty. His cultivation of a workspace allowing subordinate officers to contribute meaningfully, regardless of their rank, displayed wise and forward-thinking management. He recognized that defeating JN-25 demanded every team participant operating at their full potential, openly exchanging observations, questioning accepted notions, and assembling disconnected elements into meaningful intelligence. Thomas Dyer's commitment to working consecutive extended hours with pharmaceutical support demonstrated sacrifice exceeding conventional duty. The full Station Hypo workforce showcased that seemingly impossible obstacles yield to teamwork, creative thinking, and persistent dedication. They grasped that their mission superseded individual relaxation, sleep requirements, or physical well-being. The servicemen defending Midway, the fighter pilots engaging Japanese aircraft, the crew manning the ship's battle stations all depended upon Station Hypo delivering accurate intelligence. The technical accomplishment alone was staggering. Mastering JN-25 required transcending pure mathematics to encompass creative intuition, analytical perception, and the capacity to reason as the adversary might. The mechanical punch card devices assisted with information organization and retrieval. Yet genuine breakthroughs originated from human creativity, addressing seemingly insurmountable obstacles. The assignment's magnitude proved staggering. With roughly 30 to 33,000 operational code groups available, each transmission represented millions of feasible interpretations. Determining appropriate meaning demanded accumulated expertise across years, inspired suppositions substantiated through reviewing other traffic, and combining partial elements into usable intelligence. No modern computers existed, no digital analytical systems, no algorithmic learning mechanisms, simply writing instruments, paper sheets, data cards, and human consciousness stretched to absolute extremes. The analysts understood that moments mattered fundamentally, that the following intercepted message might contain information saving countless American soldiers. The broader consequences transcended Midway itself. Rochefort's achievements demonstrated signals intelligence could provide winning advantage in contemporary combat. It established that channeling resources toward cryptanalysis, however prohibitively challenging the undertaking appeared, could generate consequences reshaping military history. It illustrated military command that valuing intelligence practitioners and implementing their suggestions, despite contradicting prevailing assumptions, could yield triumphs otherwise unachievable. The dramatic alteration of the Pacific struggle, inaugurated at Midway, generated consequences reverberating globally across subsequent decades. Japan's ultimate defeat produced American governance and Japan's metamorphosis into a constitutional democracy and trusted ally. The Pacific Island territory became essential Cold War strategic positions. Naval aviation approaches perfected throughout Pacific campaigns would remain decisive across 8 subsequent decades of naval conflict. The cryptanalysis methods created at Station Hypo would become the extensive worldwide signals intelligence framework of the National Security Agency. The understandings gained through decrypting JN-25 shaped American signals intelligence philosophy throughout the subsequent global ideological conflict and onward. The merging of code-breaking, communications analysis, and battle intelligence became universal methodology. The application of mechanical punch cards and eventually digital technologies to code-breaking transformed the whole profession. The recognition that signals intelligence demanded linguistic familiarity and tactical comprehension alongside mechanical expertise molded recruitment and instruction at intelligence establishments. In 1985, the surviving members of Station Hypo and other Pacific Theater cryptanalysts assembled for a reunion celebration. Men in their 60s and 70s collected to recall their youthful selves laboring through exhausting hours in that basement dungeon, racing against hours to furnish their command any possible tactical edge. They recounted tales of the dive-bombing offensive destroying 3 carriers instantaneously, the water deception validating that AF designated Midway, the marathon working sessions maintained by caffeine and stimulant medication, of Rochefort functioning in his dressing robe because uniform clothing became unbearable in the oppressive surroundings. Several experienced tears, recalling companions who fell during the war. Many felt amazed considering what they had accomplished employing such rudimentary apparatus. Every participant comprehended they had participated in something extraordinary, that their contributions bore significance affecting the trajectory of civilization. The gathering finally permitted numerous individuals to speak openly about their wartime participation, sharing experiences that classification had kept confidential for 4 decades following the war. Edwin Layton, by then approaching his 80s, addressed the gathering and discussed their collective achievements. He recollected Rochefort's assurance when communicating intelligence to Nimitz on May 27, 1942, during the Pacific Fleet Staff Conference, his willingness to wager his professional prospects on his findings, the gallant resolve necessary to hold his position when Washington officials objected strongly. He recounted that May 27, 1942, moment when Rochefort ultimately delivered exact information to Nimitz specifying precisely where and precisely when Japanese forces would strike. That intelligence's accuracy had astonished everyone involved. The American carriers had taken positions guaranteeing maximum advantage. The Japanese had advanced directly into a completely orchestrated surprise offensive. Without individuals like Rochefort declining to concede the problem exceeded resolution capacity, continuing despite circumstances that should have prompted surrender, accepting that intelligence and examination could determine historical outcomes, none of this happens. The gathering finished with collective recognition, capturing Station Hypo's fundamental contribution. One of the remaining analysts rose and communicated what occupied everyone's consciousness. His statement reflected not merely their separate ordeals, but the deeper meaning underlying their collaborative success. We arrived as puzzle specialists, mathematicians, linguists, engineers, problem solvers. We left transformed into individuals who redirected civilization, not using weapons, but employing comprehension, not applying force, but wielding knowledge. We deciphered adversary thinking, and by comprehending them, we preserved countless American soldiers and curtailed a ghastly conflict. Recognition reached some among us. Countless remained undiscovered. Joseph Rochefort invested his profession pursuing righteousness instead of political convenience. Thomas Dyer persisted through exhaustion during marathon sessions powered by stimulants. Each participant surrendered their complete capability because they recognized failure's consequences. We demonstrated knowledge constitutes genuine authority, that comprehending your opposition defeats him as decisively as weapons technology, that devoted individuals possessing appropriate preparation and determination can accomplish what appears unachievable. The Japanese communications seemed insurmountable. Approximately 30 to 33,000 code groups, heavily encrypted, perpetually transforming. Yet we accomplished it. We triumphed not through chance. We succeeded because intelligence guided us, because commitment exceeded reasonable limitations, because perseverance sustained us, because the stakes demanded achievement. Midway's sailors battled with extraordinary bravery, pilots charging into devastating defensive fire. Maintenance specialists repaired aircraft under overwhelming difficulty. Commanders implemented daring tactical choices. Crew members performed crisis management while vessels took damage. Yet none of this materialized without intelligence foundations. Without codebreakers delivering Admiral Nimitz the singular element he required most, sureness regarding opponent behavior, communicated with certainty on May 27, 1942. Honoring Joseph Rochefort, born May 12, 1900, who departed earthly existence before his earned recognition eventually came on May 30, 1986. Honoring Thomas Dyer and every codebreaker who sacrificed rest, vitality, and occasionally sanity during those brutal non-stop periods deciphering opponent dispatches. Honoring the interpreters synthesizing our breakthroughs, the analysts discovering arrangements within seeming randomness, the radio personnel intercepting the communications we examined, all participants in that basement who could never disclose their contributions, because classification maintained secrecy for decades afterward. You transformed world events, you protected thousands, you confirmed that understanding, both as intelligence data and philosophical perception, constitutes warfare's greatest instrument. Breaking JN-25 and furnishing American military command the knowledge guaranteeing Midway's triumph fundamentally represents humanity operating at maximal capacity. Triumph requires neither superior physical power nor substantial weaponry. Achievement demands superior comprehension of your adversary relative to his comprehension of yourself. Achievement requires persistence, exceeding typical human capability. Achievement demands synthesizing multiple fields: mathematics, language comprehension, cultural familiarity, instinct and tactical judgment, into functioning understanding. Achievement requires military authorities prepared to rely upon analyst recommendations despite contrary conventional opinion. Achievement demands cooperative organizations subordinating private ambition to collective purpose. We provided all of this, consequently exhibiting that intelligence work, methodical, rigorous, understated work executed in obscurity by individuals rejecting acclaim, remains as transformational as openly dramatic military ventures. 5 to 6 minutes of bombing destroyed 3 carriers. Nevertheless, those moments transpired because 6 months of continuous cryptanalytic labor preceded them, because Joseph Rochefort carried conviction that Japanese naval transmissions could be deciphered, because Thomas Dyer accepted marathon responsibilities when essential, because mathematicians, linguists, and specialists rejected concluding the undertaking was insurmountable, because Admiral Nimitz possessed sufficient assurance and intelligence to stake everything upon it. We triumphed repeatedly throughout the Pacific struggle, spanning 4 calendar years. Nevertheless, decisive triumph materialized on June 4, 1942, when American bombing aircraft discovered Japanese carriers at their period of supreme vulnerability. That represented no accident. That represented intelligence work. That demonstrated the consequences of committing resources toward adversary comprehension, persisting past seemingly unachievable obstacles, assembling highly skilled individuals, and permitting complete operational flexibility. Midway's fundamental teaching seems straightforward yet weighty. Understanding equals authority. Comprehension produces triumph. Intelligence in all meanings produces global transformation. We confirmed it, consequently participating in civilization's salvation from authoritarian control. Applause erupted from the assembled group. Men preserving their wartime participation in silence for 4 decades following cessation of hostilities, who had never possessed capacity to disclose their participation to loved ones, who had observed recognition distributed to others while maintaining their own invisibility, ultimately experienced the honor they deserved. Converting anonymous codebreakers into celebrated contributors required 40 years, though their fundamental contributions transcended temporal measurement. Midway's victory manifested throughout multiple theaters: upon carrier flight decks where pilots confronted impossible opposing strength, within dive bomber cockpits where youthful servicemen executed steep descents through defensive armaments, upon Yorktown where repair crews battled vessel damage, within command offices where Admiral Nimitz and subordinate leadership implemented bold maneuvers. Nevertheless, this achievement originated in a Pearl Harbor basement, in which a modest assemblage of analysts, specialists, and researchers rendered impossibility into certainty, transforming 5-digit numerical sequences into Japanese operational blueprints in which depleted individuals persisted non-stop because they comprehended failure's catastrophic meaning, in which cooperation, imagination, and relentless perseverance accomplished what appeared beyond human capacity. Joseph Rochefort died in 1976 in Torrance, California, having reached 76 years. His passing arrived prior to receiving his recognition, prior to his narrative achieving complete disclosure, prior to universal knowledge of his accomplishments and his colleagues' work. Nevertheless, his influence persists within intelligence institutions he participated in establishing, throughout methodologies he pioneered, via the demonstrated reality that comprehending your opposition represents warfare's greatest mechanism. The codebreaker who comprehended Japanese strategy and revolutionized history. The man in sleeping clothes laboring in a basement who determined the Pacific conflict. The administrator who sacrificed career opportunities pursuing justice. The mathematician demonstrating that understanding constitutes genuine authority. Such individuals comprised Joseph Rochefort, comprised Station Hypo, comprised America's transformation into a nation capable of comprehending Japanese intelligence and consequently capable of prevailing in a struggle that seemed hopeless following the Pearl Harbor devastation. The account of JN-25 and the people conquering this encryption stands among historical accomplishments' pinnacle demonstrations. It confirms warfare depends not exclusively upon military capability, yet upon intellectual capacity, that our strongest implements frequently embody mathematical reasoning, linguistic mastery, and willingness to persist beyond typical human restrictions, that dedicated individuals operating in obscurity can reshape civilization as profoundly as massive military formations. June 4, 1942, fundamentally redirected the Pacific conflict. Nevertheless, the essential metamorphosis started earlier, via continuous cryptanalytic commitment, individuals declining to acknowledge Japanese communications as insurmountable, specialists accepting marathon work amid impossible circumstances, professionals confirming intelligence-determined events as thoroughly as battleships, demonstrating that comprehending opponents constitutes the pathway to their defeat. They represented mathematicians, linguists, servicemen, officers, and soldiers. They constituted the specialists furnishing the United States with knowledge determining the Pacific triumph. They remained proof that comprehension ultimately constitutes supremacy.